Well, it is the top of the hour, so we will begin. And I want to welcome you all to this theological forum on Zoom from Eden Seminary. And we've been holding these or planning these. We've held one in response to the COVID crisis and as a way of providing resources of theological education for the church, for leaders in the church and for the church at large. And we are grateful for your gathering with us this evening. This is a project really in process, and so we are eager to have your feedback. There is a chat option on Zoom, as I'm sure you all are learning over these days, and feel free to offer your comments about the forum in general, or you may email. There'll be an email in the comments for you to send your comments to if you would like to do it that way. Our session this evening is led by two of our wonderful colleagues at the seminary, Mary Schaller Blaufuss, who is our Vice President for Advancement, and Professor Kristen Leslie, who is our Professor of Pastoral Care and Theology. And they have joined forces this evening for us to offer us reflections out of their experience, considerable experience in disaster assistance and response, for theological reflections from past catastrophes. So they have some reflections for us, and we look forward to their forum this evening. Also on our call tonight from our seminary staff is Reverend Katie Hotsey, who is offering us support, and she will be available to answer your questions in the chat if you're having any trouble with connectivity or difficulty in this experience. Please just signal her in the chat section directly to her. The format of the forum is for Mary and Kristen to offer about 20 or so, 25 minutes of their presentation. And at the as they're speaking, we invite you to pose questions in the chat column, and I will be gathering those as best I'm able and pose those to them at the end of their talk. And that is really the shape of the forum. I want to offer a little bit of a teaser for our forum next week. We are being led by Reverend Sally Thomas and Dr. Laurel Kepf-Taylor from our faculty in Hebrew Bible and Religious Education. They are offering a forum entitled Lemonade from Lemons, Recognizing, Reclaiming, and Reimagining Faith Formation at Home and Remotely. So a forum focusing on all aspects of faith formation in the church and how we go about that in this time of social distance and using these different tools of social media and digital connection. Why don't we begin this evening before our presentation with a word of prayer. Gracious God, we give thanks for the witness of your church across time, a witness that bears truth, that whether gathered or scattered, we are held in your presence, power, and purpose to be your people. We pray tonight for our communities, our congregations, the organizations and institutions, the people we serve, as a part of our calling to follow your Son. We pray for the courage and strength in these days to, as Paul charged the Corinthians, to stand firm in the faith and to let love be our guide. We pray you will give us what we need to be agents of your justice, love, and mercy with and for your world. In Christ's name, we pray. Amen. So Kristen and Mary, I hand it off to you.
So friends, thanks for joining us this evening. It's fun to see faces that I know and some new friends on my computer screen, so welcome. Mary and I talked about how we're going to do the time together. I'm going to spend the first 10 minutes or so laying out, sharing with you some of the work that minds that are much better than mine have laid out to begin to think about what does it mean to be in the time of disaster. I'm going to lay that out, and then Mary's going to give us some theological reflections after that. And to do that, I'm going to share with you my computer screen, if you will. So I am sharing with you a graphic that is called the phases of disaster. And what I want to share with you, at Eden Seminary, I teach a course called Ministry in Times of Disaster. And in fact, this semester I'm teaching a DMin course on pastoral care in the public arena, all coming, unfortunately, too comfortably to bear right now. But what I want to do is share with you just this idea. I've given you the citation there, and you may want to take a screenshot of this or pull out your phones and take a picture of it. At the end of this, I have a bibliography that I'll also put up that you could also get a screenshot or use your phone to take a picture. You can also, we're going to have this video library so that you can see it later. But what I want to do is talk to you about phases of a disaster. A couple words to start out. All disasters are not the same, and they're never this linear or this neat. But this gives us a way to begin to think about engaging a time that feels very unsure and disastrous. Access to resources in a community always affect one's response to a disaster. And this graphic and this theory on disaster work, which comes out of folks who do critical incident stress management and other disaster relief, this assumes that there is one critical incident, one critical event that happens and everything follows. You and I know that right now this is a critical incident that's unfolding before our very eyes. So recognizing that, what I wanted to do is share with you and talk a little bit about each of these phases. We are in what you would call the pre-disaster phase, where we're getting all sorts of warnings and threats. And there's not going to be one impact of this disaster, but we're going to find it rolling out where it's going to hit us over and over again. Those who have lost their jobs are feeling this already. Those of us who have family members who are, that we're not able to see, are distanced from them because of social distancing, personal distancing. We are beginning to feel that. But there's kind of these different phases of it. So there's kind of that first phase of the pre-disaster, which is kind of the warning, which is kind of the anticipation. This is where all the media begins to push out information to us. All of us know who are on social media, just the deluge of information that we're getting right now from all sorts of sources. We all know that it's exhausting. What I want to do is quickly lay out these phases for you, and then I want to go back and revisit just very briefly some pastoral leadership responses in all these phases. So this first kind of phase is that pre-disaster. In this theory, this notion of whenever the impact happens, I think in this case, we're going to feel the impact as people lose jobs, as people begin to die, as the system begins to implode on itself. We're going to be able to feel just how ratcheted down that all feels. That's followed by this sense of engagement by the community, which we begin to, where resources are very quickly put into place. We kind of know this as this heroic phase of where rescue resources are put into place, where there is a sense of real agency, but also a sense of hecticness, because people are trying to create responses as they go. And so there are repeated and overlying responses to at this moment, kind of in this heroic phase, but kind of there is a sense of emotional high because of the sense of agency. While there might not be a great sense of direction, all of it, people feel like they can try something. So anybody who is learning how to use Zoom, all the social media, there is that sense of, once you kind of figure it out, that sense of I've mastered it, if you will, and that sense of agency, that sense of I'm doing okay. There are downturns, but I'm doing okay. This kind of culminates in that sense of a honeymoon phase, that we're community cohesion. And in any of the natural and human-made disasters, you see that sense of community cohesion. This is where communities come together, and you see lots of hashtags come out. We're going to see these hashtag pandemic, hashtag all sorts of things. You'll find them now. Hashtag Corona. We're even beginning to see those now. But this is where there's significant media coverage. It's all centered around this, and other issues that have been come to play in our lives kind of get set aside because we're so focused in this moment. This is where some heroes emerge in this honeymoon phase, because people step forward. Some of the NIH people coming forward right now, some of the physicians who are trying to give us good news about what's going on and how to engage it. This is kind of that honeymoon phase. Pretty quickly, what happens after that is that sense of disillusionment that will happen, because we're going to see resources are not used fairly through the community. We're going to go from we're all in this together to I'm going to grab all that toilet paper that I can get because I need it, and just because other people can't get it, I need it. This is where we begin to see resources disintegrating. Anybody who has been through a disillusionment phase know that this is where clergy who are so involved in these previous phases begin to pretty quickly feel it in a tremendous level and wanting to help our congregations in this disillusionment phase. And there's very little that we can do as we begin to fall down. Actually, there's lots we can do, but there's little that we can do to kind of infuse hope that will keep us from feeling this disillusionment phase. This is kind of the, if you will, the Israelites wandering in the desert here. And you remember from Exodus, this is where the Israelites turned to Moses. If you had only left us in the where we were, we could have made it. But you've brought us here now. This is where we're going to begin to hear our congregations thinking we're not doing enough, and they're going to get angry at us. They're going to turn because they don't know where else to turn. If anybody who's in leadership is going to feel that sense of disillusionment. Anybody who comes into this sense with previous experiences of trauma at all are going to be re-traumatized in this phase. And you see that the disillusionment phase, if you look at the graph where it says trigger events around the disillusionment phase, it goes much lower than the emotional level of the impact itself. That's the scary part of this model, is that as we begin to do inventory all of this, we're going to hit, it's going to take us a while. And the disillusionment, because the resources aren't shared equitably and people are dying, and members of our congregation, we can't help. The emotional lows go pretty low in this, if this schematic plays out as it is. And then the kind of that reconstruction phase builds slowly as we work through grief, and we have setbacks, we have anniversary events. If you remember Ferguson, if you remember Sandy Hook, if you remember any large catastrophe, Katrina, this all in one way or another played out. I want to quickly suggest kind of pastoral responses in each of these phases. And I'm mindful that with all the religious professionals in the room, you too could fill in these phases. But let me just suggest a few. In the kind of the pre-disaster, which is where we are, and building into the heroic, this is where we're working to stabilize our ministries. This is where we're checking on people. This is where we're building the communal sense of who's engaged, who can we partner with. This is absolutely the time of who are our partners in this work to come, because we're going to come into this disillusionment phase and we're going to need those partners. The going through the disillusionment phase is where we're going to, that sense of wandering in the wilderness is it's going to require a sense of constancy, a sense of, as much as possible, less anxious presence in the face of a lot of anxiety, which we're already seeing. This is where, just during this disillusionment phase, is going to require really good communication skills. Communicate as much as possible to folks in your communities and with your colleagues about what you need, recognizing that you're going to need to let go of some things because you just cannot do it all. Particularly in the disillusionment phase, you're going to find some of us are outward facing pastoral people where we look to the larger issues, and some of us are internal facing, that is, that we attend to those in our community, and that's pretty much all we can do, or even our families. Those in some ways are two different charisms that we need to work together on, that one is not better than the other, and they rely on each other. So if you're an internal facing person, find the person who's the external person and team with them. In the kind of, as you begin to build in that reconstruction phase, that's where you're going to begin to find hope amid the dissolution, that there's never going to be a sense of pure hope, but you're going to continue to find those things that give you a sense of momentary hope that you can continue to grasp onto. Even now, because we're in spring and you go outside and you hear the birds, those are the things that you want to hold on to now, recognizing we're coming into the phase it's going to be a harder one. I'm mindful that this trajectory of community healing doesn't work for every community, and it is geared more toward one-time event, and we're not even there yet really with what's going to be happening. So the one thing I want to leave you with is, as you think about the work of Judith Herman, and you'll find her book in the bibliography that I've given you, Trauma and Recovery, she talks about 3 responses in when we work with folks who are traumatized. First, you have to work with them to feel safe. If they don't feel safe, they can't do much else. So safety and establishing and attending to it. Secondly, helping people to remember and mourn that which was lost and that which was the kind of the instability that we have. And then thirdly, community, getting people to attach to each other, because that's in fact where we can feel a sense of agency, when we can be working in a community. So I'm going to turn it back over to Mary, because I think my time is way up. So Mary, you're on.
Hi, everyone. I am so pleased to be able to be with you and to join Kristen in this presentation and input part of our session. I plan to speak as much from my past experience as my current experience. I see some faces on the screen that I've interacted with over the years. I have been at Eden Seminary since August of this year, and for the previous 15 years worked really closely in disaster preparedness and recovery with the national setting of the United Church of Christ, with volunteers, and then later as leading the team in the denomination that worked on global and domestic disasters. And as Kristen showed this graph and these phases of a disaster to me, when we were planning this, I said, yes, we've been working this. This is a way that no graphic is perfect for, it doesn't fit every situation, but to know that we can normalize those kinds of phases that we're moving through is so important. I also truly believe that disasters, catastrophes, crises are a time when we as religious professionals need to put on our hats of theological imagination. And so that theological imagination is important for the world because we do a lot of responding to what's being said, or we interact with somebody who has a similar or a different viewpoint than we do. But this is also a time for us to take the resources of our faith and of our community and to reflect on who God is and who are we in the midst of that relationship with God in some pretty intentional ways, I believe. It's happening in the society already. We are operating out of theological frameworks. The schools have put aside their days that the children are not in classroom settings, and they won't have to make up these days because they're called acts of God days. The insurance industry has acts of God that basically says we're not in control, and by implication says God is somehow responsible for what is happening. We are in the midst of theology now. Those of you who preach from the Common Lectionary probably did some reflecting on John chapter 9 last week, where the question comes to Jesus, who sinned, Rabbi, this man or his parents, that this boy was born blind? And if you notice, Jesus doesn't respond to that particular question. Instead, he reframes the narrative. And so we have the opportunity to reframe some of the narrative of what we are experiencing in these days. Because I truly believe that who we understand God to be shapes our actions, and our actions and our experiences shape the way that we understand God. And so I want to just share a few stories with you by sharing my screen now. And I have 3 different theological points of reflection that I want to share this evening. One is my work in the past has been primarily with natural disasters. And so my reflections have come out a lot of what is the relation of God with creation. And so God is creator and we as co-creators. Life is all about change and movement. We know that without the blood going through our veins, we have no life. This is a picture of the Grand Canyon. And it is one of those examples to me about how the movement of God and the way that God uses creation to shape other parts of creation, being co-creators, shapes our world. So who is God in the midst of disaster? Well, God is relationship. And Terence Fretheim is one of the authors that I met way back when I was a student at Eden Seminary in his Suffering of God work. And I have re-encountered Dr. Fretheim's work lately in my work with Theologies in Disaster, because he has written a book called Creation Untamed, the Bible, God, and Natural Disasters. I highly recommend it to you. And he is talking in that creation is good, but not perfect. And we can get into all kinds of theology about what perfect is. But his basic theme is that God is working with us and through us as creatures and creation in order to shape creation. God uses those of us who are God's creatures. And sometimes those creatures get out of control. The cells of cancer, when they multiply at uncontrollable ways, or a COVID virus, where those creatures and that creation is out of control and harming rather than helping. Sometimes those creatures are limited and maybe unintentionally or intentionally create harm rather than good in their action. I think often of the Mississippi River. I started working in disaster recovery at the time of Hurricane Katrina in 2005. And in 2005, the Mississippi River was not only a place that had been channeled over the years to be a source of trade, to be a place where communities had grown up along the banks. It had also been at the mouth of the river as it moved into the Gulf of Mexico, had been a place where the marshes and the natural barriers against hurricane destruction had been covered over. And so much of the destruction in the New Orleans area related to Hurricane Katrina in 2005 was really because there were no natural barriers, as well as the human-caused reasons for that disaster of the levees breaking. Co-creators can be negative and limited. We can also be positive and life-giving. I think so often about as climate change comes and impacts our world, people in Bangladesh are among the most impacted in that. And they have rising seas that are coming onto their land. And people in Bangladesh are so resilient, have taken this opportunity to build houses that are on stilts, have taken this opportunity to have warning systems put into place, have taken this opportunity to do farming in some places in different ways in order to mitigate against those rising sea levels. So God is creator and we are co-creators. God is also redeemer. And as God is redeemer, we act in solidarity. We are so interdependent. And if nothing else in this pandemic, we are experiencing firsthand how interdependent we are. And from a Christian perspective, especially a liberation theologian, John Sabrino can help us in that acts of solidarity in our independence by, if we're so interdependent, then how do we know how to act? And he challenges us to act with the most vulnerable who are at the center and their well-being being the criteria of our action. I have been using background for my Zoom meetings across up here. It's across from El Salvador and painted by one of the co-workers of Dr. Sabrino. And it is a reminder to me about how it is the most vulnerable who are to be at the center of who we are and how we act. The pictures on your screen are some that I took in 2014 following the earthquake in Haiti in 2010. And the action of solidarity is that the agency of those who are impacted, the agency of those who might otherwise be on the margins, is the center of what we are to be about. In the bottom part of this photo collage is a cinder block building and two brightly colored buildings in front of it. This is a latrine. And one of the ways of agency and putting people who are the most vulnerable at the center is that rather than just plopping up a whole bunch of new houses, the work that I had the wonderful opportunity to be part of is the latrines were what was built first, and the houses then built around that, and far enough away from the houses so that sanitation systems could be part of that. God is sustainer, and God as sustainer enables us to commit for the long term. This point would be based on God's steadfast love that we see all through Psalms and other Old Testament. It's based on the last part of the Great Commission in Matthew 28, where Jesus promises the disciples that he will be with them, be with us until the end of the age. And so this photo from Glacier National Park reminds me all the time about God's sustaining love, that in the midst of a forest fire that burned out of control and completely destroyed the forest, that life finds a way. By life finding a way, it gives us the encouragement to commit for the long term. When I think about the work that has been done in the phases of disaster following the 2014 killing of Michael Brown in Ferguson, I think about that long-term commitment, that commitment that continues to build community organizing, continues to build strong communities. And in that long-term commitment, in that sustainability, we participate in relief, in response, in recovery and rebuilding, and we build resilience. And that's where I want to end for this evening, is on that resilience. Because unfortunately, this will not be the last catastrophe that we live through and are part of. In terms of natural disasters, climate change is causing all kinds of changes that make those natural disasters increase in their intensity and their frequency. This interdependence of our world that we are experiencing now helps us to know that we are not alone. It also means that we might likely experience other catastrophes of this kind of magnitude. And so I just thoroughly encourage each of us to trust our own voices, to trust our resources of faith and our community, and to be theologians as we are called to be.
Thank you, Mary and Kristen, very much for the review of the sort of life cycle of a disaster in the social, emotional, and relational responses, community responses, and in these theological reflections. There were a lot of great comments and questions coming on the chat as we were listening, and I've picked three. I hope there's enough time. The first was a group of people reflecting on, this is really for Kristen, on the life cycle of the disaster. Linda Gastrich shared that it's sobering to hear that we're still in the pre-disaster phase. So there were folks struggling with that. Virginia and Tori also agreed, you know, how can that be when people are already dying, when we're seeing these impacts? And then with that, the question from Linda, you know, in light of the fact that so much has happened already and people are already at such a stirred state, how are we as religious leaders to process this trajectory that we're on publicly? And I can imagine a lot of what might be behind that question, but I think there's a lot there for you to respond to, so I'll leave it there.
There is a lot to say. Linda and others, thank you for those we all know, I'm going to say some of the things that you already know, which is we're in this for a long haul. This is not an immediate response to anything. So particularly for those of us who like to have fast responses, this is going to be harder because we really have to measure how we respond, which always goes with self-care. I am mindful that self-care is not in contrast to other people's care. And particularly, I'm mindful that in order to do self-care, I think we can factor in the most vulnerable when we think about our own self-care. So many of us are committed to the larger issues of people's lives that to have to separate ourselves from them, we can't do that. So how do we navigate our own self-care as we consider the most vulnerable as significant to who we are? A number of you asked about, are we, if this is not the pre-disaster, for some this feels like the pre-disaster, and some for it's full-blown disaster. Absolutely, absolutely. So it's not like we're all in one place of this and we will revisit different parts of it. It's absolutely how we are affected in the community and what are our resources to be able to navigate of all of this. It depends on where we are in on this cycle. Again, it's not a perfect diagram or a concept, but begins to help us understand the larger trajectory. I do want to share with you one thing because I saw one of the questions, and maybe Deb, I'm jumping ahead here, but one of the questions was about self-care. And I put together this very quick list. You might want to take a picture of it. A very quick list of strategies for self-care. Starting with your brain can't work as well because stress messes with your ability to concentrate. So normalize that for now. 2, pick one day at a time, one time in a day to look at the big picture and focus on the tasks in front of you. We're inundated with media. So don't always go to the media because you will go crazy. 3, assess what your gifts are and how they meet the current moment. Don't pretend you're good at everything and you can't do it all. 3, please savor the sweet moments. Those are very important. I've learned that from Linda Gastrich in her evening prayer times that she's putting up. 5, do less. You have to do less because we are living in the moment. So how do you kind of let the extras and less timely matters take a back seat? Because really, does your basement need to be cleaned right this week? 6, when triage is important, recognize you'll be moments later that you have to pause and slow down. And we're not always good about that. So we're going to have to find partners to help us navigate that together. This is a time of adapting and pivoting, which means that you will recognize you'll be doing things quite differently. And for those of us who like patterns, that's very hard. 8, trauma responses will emerge. Try to look at how your body responds to trauma. When you're in a trauma moment, it's very hard to think your way through anything. So to begin ahead of time, to begin to think about what does your body do when it's beginning to be in crisis and suffering and trauma. Be mindful of that. 9, rituals and structures of self-care are key. And then we are not God. And we have to look to each other and trust each other to work together on this in creative ways. That's just a beginning self-care strategies.
Thank you, Kristen. Another question, this was asked by Virginia. And I think it's Virginia Scheffelbein. Good to see you, Virginia. And Virginia noted that there's a connection between this presentation and what you were sharing about how in the disillusionment phase, people are coming to see that resources aren't being shared equitably, that's one of the components of that phase. And Virginia connected that to David's presentation last week about the stages of fear or the stages of emotional response to a pandemic. The final one of which is after, I think, something like denial and terror comes shame in the reflection on the experience. And Virginia was connecting that shame phase that David talked about last week to this issue of inequitable resources, and offered this very, I think, poignant and compelling dilemma many of us are in, right? Virginia says, I'm relieved my local hospital is getting more supplies, PPE and other things. And yet I know that other communities are not. And this seemed to kind of connect with Mary's insights about solidarity and the call to respond, to be in solidarity with those who are facing structural injustices, economic disparities that in a disaster result in these kinds of inequitable distribution of resources. So I just thought you both could maybe reflect on that comment and question and connection.
Well, I'll take a go first. So the idea that we are part of a cycle reinforces that the best response to a catastrophe is to be prepared beforehand. And what a catastrophe does is it disrupts and it makes visible the inequities that existed before. And so not only is the best response to be prepared before, but that resilience sense, and perhaps this is what gives us a way forward from that shame or that grief, is that sense of purpose, that our purpose is building resilience and strengthening systems for the next disaster or to prevent the next disaster.
Wonderful, thank you. And the final observation question comes from Pete Gecky, who is the Dean at Memphis Seminary, who's joining us this evening. And he noted in the comments, this was in your portion of the presentation, Mary, how this particular nature of this pandemic and the crisis we're in has a challenging tension in the question of how do we do solidarity when we're also practicing social distance. And so what would you offer there?
Right, we don't know how to do that. And so I join you in the struggle. I am in solidarity with you in the struggle. And maybe the thing that I would add is for us to continually be defining and be aware of who are the vulnerable, because in this disaster, the vulnerable are different, perhaps, than in some other disasters. One of the things that I keep up with are responses of refugees and asylum seekers. And it is particularly difficult in refugee camps or for people who are situated at the southern US border to practice social distancing because of their situation. So the awareness, I think, and bringing those pieces into not only the conversation, but into the action and the networks that we're building and that we work to keep strong, I think is one way of practicing that solidarity.
I also want to suggest that, in fact, we talk about social distancing, and we're talking about physical distancing, not social distancing. And in fact, in some ways, some of us are more connected right now because of social media. I think the most vulnerable are those who don't have access to some technology right now. And I think that's a huge issue. But to recognize that, in fact, we have the ability to connect in ways right now where we're recognizing that we have not taken advantage of up into this. And so I think I don't want us to forget. I want us to remember that we are responding in some creative ways that are giving us an increased connection with some, and at the same time distancing ourselves from some who don't have access.
Great. Well, I'm afraid we're coming to the end of our time. Last week it seemed to go too quickly, and this one too. So, but we know that you all are likely to have another Zoom call after this. So we won't keep you much longer. Thank you so much to Mary and to Kristen for this engaging and helpful presentation. It will be posted, recorded, with all of your faces on it. So if you want to not only hear the presentation again, but just see everybody's wonderful face, you may find it on our website, on the Eden Online part of our website, as well as on our social media pages. And we welcome you to look for that. Again, next week, we will be joined by Reverend Sally Thomas and Dr. Laurel Cuff-Taylor for a presentation on reimagining and reclaiming faith formation at home and remotely. So looking at all aspects of religious education and faith formation in the church and how we do that in these times. So we invite you to return next Thursday at 7 o'clock. You'll see the invitation, the links, and the announcement, and you can register for that at the website link, and you'll get the Zoom invitation. So we welcome you to do that. So God bless, and we'll see you next week. Bye-bye.